I'm excited to be joined today by Dr. Ben Smith. He's a neuroscientist and postdoctoral research fellow in the Social Affective Neuroscience Lab at the University of Oregon. Decision-making is the common thread in Ben's work and spans areas including the social neuroscience of risky decision-making, computational modeling of the reward and punishment system in the brain during decision-making, the abstract, concrete, tangibility access of the prefrontal cortex, which I'm certainly going to ask you about, and moral and ideological decision-making, as well as more recently, some work on habits, health, decision-making in COVID and effective altruism. Ben, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Thank you. It's really great to be here.
So there's one thing in your list of research interests that I completely didn't understand. What is the abstract, concrete tangibility axis of the prefrontal cortex?
Yeah, that's work I haven't followed up on in a few years, but it's something I've been wanting to go back to. One of those things I've been wanting to go back to. So there is a stream of research in social psychology on temporal discounting, abstract processing, and linking, I guess, thinking about abstract processing as kind of related to the future. The concept I'm gesturing towards is, I think, psychological distance. And so that's related to the construal level theory, and all this posits that there's something psychologically general about things that are further away, more distant, less concrete, and there's some research suggesting if you were imagining, say they asked students to imagine activity on a campus, or what a campus would look like, showing them pictures of a university that was supposedly a couple of miles away, or was 1,000 miles away in Italy. And when students were told this campus that they were viewing pictures of was close by, they described it in quite concrete terms. When they were describing this campus as if it was 1,000 miles away in Italy, then they were using more abstract terms to describe what they were seeing. And so there's an idea that potentially we have that link, bidirectional link, where if something seems further away in time or space, or maybe distance on a social graph even, then we will process it more abstractly rather than more concretely. And that's got implications in habit research. So we're thinking, temptations can be quite often concrete. You have a very visceral feeling of hunger or craving, say for a cigarette or whatever it is that you crave, and that is balanced by, say, the desire that these quite abstract long-term goals to, say, be healthier, or achieve more, and so bringing it back to axis of tangibility, the idea I was seeing in research in neuroscience, people talking about, say, processing and movement, or other forms of decision making, where in the dorsal prefrontal cortex there is much more sort of abstract processing of choices, and as you move more posterior through the brain, you're getting a lot more processing that is more concrete, related to whatever system that you're talking about. So you're moving towards the motor cortex, you're processing concrete motion. If you're moving towards the reward system, then perhaps you're going to be processing much more visceral rewards that really are arresting and grab you. And so the idea is perhaps across multiple modes, whether it's reward or it's sensory or movement, then as you move more anterior in the prefrontal cortex, you're going to have more abstract processing of decisions, and as you move more posterior, you will see more visceral or concrete processing. And looking at the temporal discounting literature, I focused on temporal discounting tasks, comparing smaller sooner and larger later, options, subjects choosing larger later, or rather trials where subjects chose larger later over a meta-analysis of 13 studies tended to have more anterior processing in those trials compared to trials where they were processing more concretely.
Mm-hmm. So I'm hearing three separate streams of thought here that I'm gonna try and reflect back to you and integrate. Let me know if I'm getting it correctly. So the first is discounting temporally, and this is the one that I think is classic decision-making studies most people have heard of, like the classic marshmallow test. Does the child want one marshmallow right now or two in 10 minutes? And a lot of children fail to wait, even though they do want two marshmallows. And that makes sense when you think about it in terms of something concrete and immediate, like the donut is here right in front of you right now, and it tastes good. Whereas something like have my ideal body is very abstract, and you might think, well, I can always go to the gym tomorrow and I get to have the donut now. So it's like win-win, even if maybe you won't actually achieve the ideal body, but it's like so abstracted and far away that it's easy to focus more on the here and now. Now, the second stream of thought, I didn't know that this worked for distance too, in addition just to time. So like you mentioned, the university experiments. And I'm wondering if this has something to do with Bayesian reasoning, which I know you've done a lot of work on. So something like people assume, well, if this is a university nearby me, then the environment is probably the same. A lot of other variables I can sort of price in, knowing that a lot of my stereotypes and assumptions about this neighborhood that I live in are probably true. Whereas if you hear that this university is in Italy and you think, I don't know much about Italy, there's just so many more degrees of freedom. So do you think people are consciously or subconsciously factoring in that uncertainty?
Yeah, I'd add that possibly, I know less about Italy because I've never been to Italy, but I probably have a lot of abstract stereotypes about it that I might be applying in a way that I don't apply abstract stereotypes to places I live in for the reasons that you've described. I've got better, more concrete knowledge. Yeah, so I think there's a lot to that. I really like that perspective.
And then the third piece of info to connect these together, the idea is that in general, whether it's for time or distance or maybe for other variables, your brain processes things on a continuum from concrete to abstract, and that it's actually localized in where the brain is doing this too. And that seems to parallel what we know about how our brain evolved. And so like the more ancient you go from an evolutionary perspective all the way down to the brainstem, it's regulating basic physiological processes. And then you get up into the limbic system, you get basic emotional drives related to finding food or sex or shelter, like your basic survival needs. And then finally, you get into the cortex, dealing with more abstract concepts that are more variable across time. And it seems like what you see in which brain areas are used in the sort of decision making from the concrete to abstract spectrum, it's more frontal regions that are involved in more abstract processing and more subcortical regions involved in the more concrete stuff. Is that right?
Yeah, so I think I'd add this research in not only in reward processing, but in actions as well. And when you're talking about actions and potentially physical actions, there's this hierarchy not only from prefrontal cortex to subcortical, but also prefrontal cortex to other parts of the cortex, like the motor cortex, right?
Hmm.
And so if you have movements that are at some level they're reflected in the motor cortex, and then if those movements are part of like a wider action plan, then you're going to need an abstract representation of that plan somehow. And so perhaps, and drawing on some older research from Mark Desposito's lab and others, like there is that hierarchy, and
Hmm.
how many like distinct sorts of levels that you can like identify in that process. I think it seems, as far as I know, is like a pretty open question.
Hmm. So is that to say that in more frontal anterior regions of the brain, you're dealing more abstractly, and then posterior in the back
Yeah.
is more tangible? So like your frontal cortex involved in like abstract decision making is up here in the front, and then the motor cortex
Mm-hmm.
is kind of back in the middle. And the idea is you're going further back, so it's becoming more tangible and more specific and more like fine-tuned motor control related to an action, as opposed to like abstract planning of that action that happens in the front.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. And I should add, like, I probably have a little bit of a gap in knowledge and like and what's going on in the parietal cortex apart from like visual processing. Um, so perhaps there's a caveat there, but then like it also would hold, for the occipital cortex, you're getting like very concrete visual representations there that then have to be organized in some abstract manner. Um, and we'll
Mhm.
leave it there. We could add
Okay.
other
So
caveats,
then
but yeah,
for
it's a good
listeners,
story. Yeah.
occipital lobe is in the very back of the brain and deals primarily with the visual system. So the idea is
Right.
if we're talking about abstract is up front and then more concrete is in the back, then I guess the idea is the most concrete is what you're actually perceiving right in front of you. So it would make sense that the visual cortex you see in the back of the brain, if this abstract up front, concrete goes in the back, theory holds true.
Right.
That's really exciting. So
Yeah.
this seems like the base theory that grounds most of your work in decision making. Correct me if I'm wrong there. And I think that's a good place to start. But then you're dealing with not only decision making in the abstract, but with decision making in like real world context, whether that's social decision or moral decision making or help deciding on what habits to introduce in your life for health or other reasons. Uh, which of those do you think would be the most illustrative place to start how this connects to the neurotheory?
Yeah, I think perhaps talking actually just in terms of like connection to what we've just been discussing, I think some of the research I'm doing right now on smoking cessation is directly relevant because I'm collaborating with Ken Fujita at Ohio State University, as well as my advisor, Elliot Berkman, and David Condon here at University of Oregon. And that work involves looking at whether there are construal level theory-based manipulations that are effective for smoking cessation. Like, can we get people thinking in more abstract terms about their decision to smoke? Um, so that if they're trying to quit, they might be able to remind themselves of these more like abstract
Uh,
consequences that would lead them to say, let's not smoke right now.
so I would have thought the opposite. I would think that if you give a smoker some abstract fact about, your likelihood of death increases by whatever percent. I mean, you're throwing a bunch of abstract things at them. Statistics are pretty abstract, and even
Yeah.
something like mortality is quite abstract. And I imagine that wouldn't be particularly effective. But if you get at something more visceral, like the image of the blackened lungs, like this is going to be you, or if you start getting emotional, like telling stories about family members who have lost family members to smokers, or like trying to get them to imagine if they have kids, for example. On one hand, the statistic of you're likely to die 5 years earlier or whatever, then you might just think, okay, that's a statistic. What does 5 years mean? But you could say something like, well, this is the difference between your grandchildren dying or you dying when your grandchildren are babies versus you getting to see them grow up an extra 5 years and be there for them. And like it seems like the more concrete those representations are, the more effective they might be likely to be.
Yeah, there's this tension in applications of construal level theory that I still, like, to be honest, haven't got clear in my mind. Like, do you want to make the future more concrete to get people to think more clearly about the future? Or is there opportunities for people to engage in more abstract thought, or more goal related, abstract goal related, or goal motivated behavior? What we're doing in our smoking study right now is asking, are there different people for whom different interventions would be more effective? And so perhaps for some people, they're going to be really arrested by these like more concrete visions of all the health consequences of smoking. Your lungs are going black, and you're going to die sooner, and then others are perhaps going to be more motivated by more abstract processing. So we're collecting data from a sample of about 2,000 people, looking at personality, cognitive ability, and we're curious about whether those factors could moderate for which of these people, like smoking primes, are more effective at changing their in the moment desire to smoke, or just which sorts of messaging they believe might be more effective for them.
Are there really people who are more motivated by things that are more abstract? I think there are certainly people who are better at it. Like maybe you can be more of an abstract thinker. You can formulate an argument rationalizing something, but then the idea is like whatever you're rationalizing would have to be some sort of base desire. So like you feel the emotion first. This is kind of related to some of Antonio Damasio's work at USC, where like affect is primary, and then your cognitive systems kind of overlaid on top of that to rationalize or achieve whatever your more primary desires are.
So you're suggesting perhaps, although some people are better at abstract rationalizations than others, this isn't going to change their behavior because those abstract rationalizations are still motivated by the emotionally driven motivations. So you don't end up with like pointing in a different direction fundamentally.
I would say that that's my base assumption, but the question was, are there really people who are more motivated by these abstract cues? So like I'm open to the possibility of it. It's just hard for me to imagine.
Yep. I couldn't tell you honestly. Perhaps not. I tend to think if you are better at abstract processing, then that's like step one towards being able to leverage that in your planning and in your decision making. And it's a necessary but perhaps not sufficient step. And then is it sufficient? I don't know, and perhaps that's something we will be able to see from this work. But I think that's a really great point. Like perhaps that is not enough, and you also need some reason to rationalize in a particular direction. This goes to, I think, some of the early work I did in my career with Steve Reed at USC, where we looked at a virtual interactive game where you would meet people. It was training for safe sex. So you would meet someone in this virtual video game environment, have sex with them in the environment, and there would be decision points along the way. Am I going to use a condom or not? And the idea with that line of research is to get people to think by sort of rehearsing in this interactive virtual environment. Perhaps you can train people to think about safer sex in the moment when they have to make a decision, because you're going to have to make these automatic decisions in the moment. And so I suppose what I might be hoping to achieve with a smoking intervention is to get people to think about these more abstract choices they might have to make in the moment. If we can build an association between say having a smoke and then these like more abstract ideas about living longer. But perhaps you're right. Perhaps like you want to fight fire with fire. Perhaps you need to be building these associations between that moment of wanting a smoke and the negative health consequences that maybe would grab you more.
I do think leveraging the abstract information is a good term for it, because you kind of leverage something to your advantage or to your base desires. And people cherry pick statistics all the time. Unfortunately, even academics do that at times, where you want data to support a specific theory. And I'm wondering how you can avoid those sorts of cognitive biases, like even in these games on sex decisions or smoking, like because no doubt the participant knows to some degree, okay, the experimenter is going to want to hear that I always pick to use a condom, or that I'm picking not to smoke. How do you avoid, or how do you incentivize making honest decisions? Like what about the game would make it make sense to choose not to use a condom, for example?
I think there doesn't seem to be really substantial demand effects, or at least there aren't enough demand effects for us to let me rephrase. There's enough variation in participant responses that not everyone is just going with like the obvious, like correct answer. And furthermore, in the smoking research, sorry, the safe sex research that I described, participants, in fact, their choices in the video game was correlated with their self-report real life choices. So this was a sample of men who have sex with men, and all who were having sex with casual partners, all sexually active. And so then we could see those who consistently used protection during sexual encounters were more likely to do so in the game. So I suppose how I would like frame it is, yes, there's probably some demand effects going on, but there's also habits or attitudes or identities, as in like I'm the sort of person who practices safe sex, coming through that are relevant in real life and in the virtual environment, and that's what we're seeing. I'd have to think more about how that might apply or not in our smoking study.
These studies on risk-taking in sex were led by Steve's wife, is that right?
No, she was very involved with the research, but like I really, at least from when I came on at USC in 2013, it was a project led by Steve, and perhaps her like.
And what's her name?
Lynn Miller.
Lynn. Okay, I'm going somewhere with this. So Ben and I met at the recent Social and Affective Neuroscience Conference, and we had an interesting conversation there. And I also met Lynn, and we were talking about these studies on men who have sex with men. And I asked, why did you use that term instead of saying something like homosexual? And I thought it was a really interesting answer, because when you're trying to get at this health risk phenomenon, like for one thing, if you limit it to gay men, then that might exclude bi men, or even potentially like straight men who are having sex with men but are in the closet. And then conversely, if you include gay men and that's your target, but they're not having sex, then that's not really useful either. So I thought that was a cool illustrative example of how specific you have to be with your wording when doing studies like this.
Yeah, and I think you put it much better than I would have, and perhaps that's because you've just been speaking
Lynn
with
put it
Lynn,
even
and
better than I did,
yeah,
so I was just trying to
right, yeah,
repeat her.
she's maybe she's been perhaps was involved, instigated that research. The project I worked in with Steve was a project of like looking at neural activity in these tasks with around 150 men, and Lynn, though, had been involved with research, and perhaps Steve, but maybe more Lynn, um, along with some of her students, Johnny Christensen, Paul Robert Appleby, and some others, had been doing that like a decade prior, and they'd so developed the game that I was describing that we then used in our area fMRI task.
Here's a common theme that I think has been coming up in this conversation. So we talked about motivations ranging from concrete to abstract, and from desires that might be a more emotional and primal right here, right now, to something like abstract, rational planning for your ideal future. And I realized when we're talking about risk-taking, I was always conceptualizing it as, okay, when you engage in risk-taking, you're always sacrificing the long-term rational planning for the here and now. And I'm wondering if there's such a thing as risk-taking in the opposite direction. Risk-taking where what you do is sacrifice the more short-term emotional desire in order to do something long-term, but it actually turns out that the short-term was good and the long-term was bad. Can you think of any examples like that?
Yeah, I mean, I can think of not that we would call decision making, but like let's say that you go and perhaps become like overeducated. Like maybe you go and study for more education, and maybe it's not because you believe in the pursuit of knowledge, but you really just think this will set you up for a great career in the future to earn more money. And perhaps you don't take into account the opportunity cost of the money that you could be earning while you're doing that PhD, and all of the other things that like you could be doing with your life while you're focusing on that. So I think like this is a real phenomenon that people engage in, and honestly, I think we probably maybe don't study it as much as we should, because but perhaps really in society still like the hardest challenges faced by the most people are still like in the opposite direction, and
Yeah,
that's why
it
we
does seem
study
like usually
risk most
risk-taking
in
is
the other
going to be,
context.
how do I
Right.
engage in the inhibitory control necessary to
There's
like,
something about that I would not call risk
uh-huh,
taking. I'm not sure why, but it's just a bad trade-off.
uh-huh.
Like, yeah,
Yeah, it's definitely understudied. It's reminding me of Paradise Lost. Have you read that?
I have not.
So that this is an epic poem by John Milton, and it's about the fall, but it's from Satan's perspective. So the whole
Hmm.
story is that, Satan shows up as a snake and he tempts Eve with the fruit. Those were all introduced by Milton and then kind of came into pop culture. They weren't in the original Bible story. Like there's not even anything that specifically says that the snake she was tempted by was Satan, but Milton fleshes that out here. And Satan is in the poem like a hyper intellectual. So he's he's basically trying to justify his motives with his intellect, saying something like, well, why shouldn't I do this to spite God and take his seat? And then I can become a better ruler, and I can do what I want, and I can create an even more perfect world. So like trying to use the intellect to take place of God, essentially to elevate oneself to ultimate authority. And then, but you see him go back and forth between, like, well, this is God we're talking about, so maybe this is a bad idea. And then, so he goes on these long monologues in the poem, and it's something like, he it seems like sometimes that's his conscience coming out. It's like he has this gut feeling of, maybe this would be a bad idea, actually. And then the rest of the monologue is him rationalizing why that doubt wasn't right. And then he goes and proceeds to, tempt Eve and all of the stuff that
Huh.
comes from that. So that's the closest analog I can think to, it's like sometimes that happens where you you get a gut feeling that might be what's the right thing to do, and then you rationalize it away. It's definitely less
Hmm.
often than having a rational plan for what is right to do, and then the gut feeling, like the temptation for something that feels good, kind of overrides that.
Yeah, so I don't haven't done like a lot of moral psychology research recently, but while at USC, I paid pretty close attention to Jesse Graham's research. He was there at the time, and he was Jonathan Haidt's student. So looking at a lot of, like, I guess, moral foundations and individual differences in morality. But um, uh, at the time, there was seemed like there were different competing sets of research, and some would say, you know, if you are making a decision that's like either altruistic or selfish, you have to choose between an altruistic or selfish option. If you are distracted or have less time to think, then you make the more altruistic choice. And then some other research would say like the complete opposite, and that like if you have more time to think, perhaps you'll make the more altruistic choice. And uh, I'd never had the opportunity to think about in which situations each of those might be true. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but there's got to be something rich
Right.
there, I
It's
think,
like a deep
because we can.
question, a philosophical question in the Hobbes-Rousseau debate. Are humans fundamentally good, in which case society is kind of the thing that corrupts us, or are we fundamentally, what's the Hobbesian term?
Yeah.
Like beast of nature, and that
Hmm.
society actually civilizes us?
Hmm. But what I like about psychology is that we can perhaps take those philosophical concepts, um,
And test them.
and then well, not just test them, but contextualize them and work out. Oh, we're neither of those. We're not all inherently good, but we're not totally depraved like in the Christian doctrine either. There's some kind of like, the universe ultimately doesn't have categories of good and evil. Those are names we come up with to describe behavior that we think is desirable for some reason or not, um, and our own um, behavior tends towards those through like some mess of like evolutionarily designed motivations that we all have. Um, and so all of those, that philosophical background seems critical because those are the questions that we want to know. Um, but then uh, how it actually works out in life, I suspect, like comes down to uh, you know, like lots of things. Like, am I running on narratives that like um, suggest like altruistic behavior? That like if I have a moment to reflect, then I'm going to do those things. Or living in a society where there are like narratives that I need to go and like look after myself because we're living in a hyper-capitalist society where no one else is going to look after me.
Mm-hmm.
And on the other hand, like I don't want to come across as like a strong proponent of the strong modularity thesis, but are we like in the moment? Am I going to be engaging with like evolutionary patterns or habits that um, uh, tend towards sharing, or is it going to be like get me what I want?
Mm-hmm. This seems like a good place to bring up the effective altruism movement that you were talking about earlier.
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah. Because first, let's define
Uh,
it. What is this, and what's the history, as much as you know?
so effective altruism is a movement to try and use reason and evidence to do the most good or do good the most effectively. And you frame that you want a sort of an answer about the movement as a whole. I could also talk about my own involvement, but I'll start with the movement since that was your question. I was begun around about mid-late 2000s, primarily with a group of philosophers at Oxford University. But there were some predecessors in philosophy as well that are important. Derek Parfit, who did research in population ethics, asking like, if we add 1,000 extra people into the world, is this like a net good or is it neutral? And Peter Singer, who started off with the drowning child in the pool. If you're walking past a pool of water and there's a drowning child and you're wearing a very expensive suit, most of us agree you have a moral obligation to jump in and save the child, even if you ruin your $1,000 suit. So now if I tell you I have an opportunity for you to save a child on the other side of the world by donating $1,000 worth of food or whatever it is that they need, why do you have less of a moral obligation to do that? Or maybe you don't.
Yeah, this could turn into a whole series of trolley problems, because imagine it's like you let the child drown and then you go sell the suit and you get $1,000 and you invest the $1,000 into like malaria vaccines that are $1 each, and then you save 1,000 children with that. I mean, it's a real crappy argument for, letting a child drown, but it makes you think about if you can suddenly put a dollar value on lives, not necessarily of like how much is your life worth and how much could I be paid to kill you, but more like how much could you save a life with? Vaccines are probably the best example of that. Then every spending purchase becomes sort of an opportunity cost in terms of human lives that could be saved with that money.
Yes, that's right. And I mean, I'm just thinking of like that's a conversation that I've seen in the effective altruism movement with varying degrees of seriousness. Sometimes people are joking about it, and sometimes like there's some people biting bullets on that as well.
Yeah, it's like introduced as a
yeah,
joke, but there is a seriousness to it where
right.
you could sell the suit and potentially save many lives with it.
Right. Which are great responses, but were you going to?
Right. I mean, ideally, you take off the suit, you save the child, then you sell the child, or no, sell the suit, and then save more children.
Yeah, right. Which is Peter Singer is shaking his fist here now because you've destroyed his thought experiment. Because he's like, no, you have to choose between the suit or the child. I should have.
You save the child and you raise him as a tailor, and then you get all the suits you need.
You get a suit back. That's right.
Okay, so how about Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. I would feel unfair not to mention these two almost feel like the predecessors of the movement who were there before it and didn't actually create it, but like it's all built on their stuff. And then you have folks like Toby Ord and Will MacAskill and others, mostly philosophers at Oxford, who were really the founders of the movement, and they got going. Yeah. I think, from my own perspective, I had a religious background that I took very seriously into my early 20s, and eventually decided that I was like pretty unpersuaded by the like supernatural claims, but still found the like underlying morality, if you strip out the ancient bullshit, to be pretty good, and something I wanted to form my life around. And so I was reading about Peter Singer's work and the drowning child and so on, and encountered the movement more as it was gathering steam, 10 years ago. When I moved back to New Zealand after doing my PhD, I started leading a discussion group in Auckland, New Zealand, on effective altruism. And it was a bit of the paradox on a personal level, because going back to New Zealand gave me, leaving that PhD program after completing it, gave me the time to do stuff like this, think a bit more broadly, which then led me to think, well, like I need to go back into research because that's where I feel like I can make an impact, which was an impulse sort of led by like thinking more about ways to do good.
You mentioned some of Jonathan Haidt's moral decision making, sort of thinking fast and slow work, and there's mixed findings on whether people's fast impulse is to do good, and then the more they think about it, the more they might behave selfishly, or if it's the other way around. And effective altruism seems kind of predicated on the idea that when people don't think, they're going to quickly behave selfishly, but if you get them thinking enough about the long-term consequences or like where their money could be spent elsewhere, then the idea is you can behave more altruistically.
Yeah, and that's a really great point. And if I think of some of the pathologies of the movement, perhaps perhaps that's where things have gone wrong. That people didn't adequately think about how actually overthinking about this can rationalize selfish behavior rather than for ostensibly altruistic grounds. But one caveat I guess I'd want to add at the expense of like a nice running theme for today is often in effective altruism, as we're consciously imagining it, at least, the battle isn't so much against a selfish self as it is against an ineffective self. Like if I want to do, perhaps a little bit less about can I get folks to give more of themselves or of their money to charity, and a little bit more, can I convince them to take what they are giving and try to think about doing that more effectively. Although that's not the only stream. I guess the Peter Singer stuff is very much, no, you should be more altruistic than you are now. But as a leader in the local community group in the movement, I always felt like, I guess, uncomfortable about pushing that side of it, because there's something like, it's a personal choice, personal values, like how much do I want to dedicate to helping other people. It seems like something that's very personal that I don't want to push onto other people. If that's something that you find inspiring, then like you should go do it. But like ultimately, I don't know, like do what you want. But then there's orders of magnitude difference in what you can do with like an effective charity, which is, say, scientifically proven via like a number of RCTs to improve health, versus other interventions that turn out that weren't tested, and when somebody goes and tests them, turn out to be like more emotional feel good stuff that make the donors feel good, but don't actually accomplish something. Now maybe that's the tie in back to what we were talking about earlier with like concrete and abstract thought, that where EA is trying to leverage is there's all sorts of things, interventions that we can do that feel pretty good. Like I am imagining helping out a child by giving them out a great day at Disney, that they maybe were never had the opportunity to go to Disneyland themselves. And man, that makes me feel really good. Like that's pretty great to imagine the smile on a kid's face. And it feels there's less. If I think about, okay, I'm going to like spend that money I could have done with that, and treat a malaria that does this kind of you don't get that same picture of a smiling face. You get a picture of like mosquitoes and kids biting and getting sick. So even though you're avoiding that, it may not have the same emotional arrest. And so the idea is, perhaps if you think about it a little bit more abstractly and run the numbers, then you might make a decision that like if your goal is to do the most good, that now seems like the best thing to do
I did a
at the expense of the
podcast
warm fuzzy.
with moral psychologist Joshua Green on this a while ago,
Cool.
and he set up this website called the Giving Multiplier. And the basic idea is that it's a website people can use when they want to donate money to a charity, and you can pick any charity in the world. And if it's one of these feel-good charities that maybe isn't particularly effective, like you can donate money to help a sick child go to Disneyland, then that's great. But then it gives you an option, like when you pick that charity and set your, let's say you're going to donate $100 to that, it says, hey, what if you donate, there's like a slider scale and you can pick $100 all to the one charity, or it says you can do like $90 to that one and $10 to one of these effective charities, and the effective ones, it could be like the malaria one you mentioned, and then they'll match whatever it is. And it's called the Giving Multiplier because the more you do to the effective one, the more it starts to match it. So if it's like if you do 90-10, then it'll match like $10. And these numbers are probably wrong, but let's say then you get $110. But then if you decide to do all 100 to the effective charity, then it'll match it and $200 go to the effective charity. So like it starts multiplying and rewards you for behaving even more effectively. And I think if you go all in on the most effective ones, it's even more than double. It might be like they match your donation times two. So then whatever you give, like triple that amount, fully goes into the effective charity. And anyway, he found that when given these options, people still don't go all in for the effective charity, even if there's a whole bunch of matching, but they are more likely to split it pretty evenly, especially when motivated by the giving multiplier. And it seems to be something like when you want to have the feel-good emotions, you don't want to get rid of those completely. So you're not going to go all in on like the mosquito bed nets. But when you do both, you still get enough of that feel-good emotion, and you get the website telling you that you're doing something super good and effective. So it's like best of both worlds.
Mm. Yeah, and man, I feel bad for having brought up so much research today that I haven't. I don't know who did it. But I remember back to a presentation at SPSB a few years ago, um, where somebody was presenting research on uh, MTurk research, where you get to click a button repeatedly. A really boring task on MTurk. You just click a button repeatedly. Every time you click, you get 1 cent. And either you get this money paid to you as a bonus or it goes to some charity. And what they found was that when people were clicking for themselves, they were pretty sensitive to, say, the amount of money that they would get from clicking, right? So like if they were getting 2 cents rather than 1 cent, they'd do a lot more clicking. Whereas if this money was going to charity, they were roughly pretty invariant to how much good this was actually doing. And I think it suggests I'm losing what's the connection there. I guess we're pretty, when it comes to getting a warm fuzzy from doing something that seems altruistic, we're pretty invariant to the scale of it, right? Like that we just need that concrete visceral image of,
Right. You just
like,
get to
we're
label
making
yourself
someone
as a
happy.
donator, but it's not
Right,
like when you do
right.
that, if you talk about it, and so maybe there's like a virtue signaling or like moral status going on here. Because if you
Yeah.
mention, I mean, the ideal form, the most moral form perhaps would be like you donate anonymously. But let's say you want to donate and you want to be able to talk about it, it's still less likely that you talk about how much you donated. You just say it. So then, especially if you're using something like the giving multiplier, then now suddenly you've just donated to two charities, even if the amount is the same. It's almost like you get
Mm.
double the points.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good
And you get
point.
to tell a story about how the new one you never had heard of before, but it's like this super effective charity. And maybe you did a bit of reading on the website. You get to report that. And the coolest thing about this website, I think, is that the giving multiplier itself is one of the effective charities that's listed on the matching. So
Mm-hmm.
the funds that they use to match the extra funds that come are all people who donated that, and it's like self-sustaining. So what they calibrate whatever the
Oh, that's
multiplication
cool.
rate is, that so however much is donated to the giving multiplier directly can be dispersed so that it's like self-sustaining.
Right, right. Well, that's clever. If I'm not was Josh Lewis involved in this project as well?
I haven't heard of Josh Lewis, but
Yeah, he's
maybe.
right. Yeah. I think he was a student of Josh Green's, and he's now an assistant professor in the marketing school at NYU, and very much focused on effective altruism psychology topics. Um, but yeah, I think uh, people get hung up on um, when they hear about the concept of altruism, they get hung up on what's true altruism. Um, and I almost think like
Mhm.
I'm sure it matters for some the motivations for um, ostensibly altruistic behavior are going to matter at some point. But I don't I think we have to keep in context how much it matters, because if there's a good result at the end, um, someone's life's been
Mhm.
made better. I'm glad that somebody had the motivation to do that, even if it was ego
Mhm.
driven or image driven or wherever it came from.
That is an interesting and optimistic take on it, because I've been a little bit skeptical of the movement, not what it's saying in general, but just
Mm-hmm.
of the people
Yeah.
who, because it's one thing to say I support effective altruism. It's another thing to self-label as an effective altruist. And I've met people who
Mm.
do that, and it
Yep.
seems kind of narcissistic to me. Again, not to want
Mm-hmm.
to be as effective as possible, but to go out of your way to say, I'm an effective altruist. Are you one too?
I've always been like pretty uncomfortable using that as a
Uh-huh.
descriptor um, of of me.
I
I
think
don't know if I
that's
have
the type of
today.
effective altruist that I
Yeah.
want. It's kind of paradoxical in the fact that
Uh-huh.
you have that humility makes me more comfortable saying that you are genuinely an effective altruist.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's I like to think of it as an aspirational thing,
Hmm.
uh I did a lot of soul searching here, and I almost came to the conclusion um that it was like almost better to accept or even tell myself the story that I was involved, precisely because it was good for my ego, or something like I like wanted to think good of myself, um, because yeah, I don't know. At least then there's like a self awareness
Hmm.
about where you're coming from, and um, uh, I used to read a lot of C.S. Lewis, like I said, like religious background, and
Hmm.
he talked about like the higher cannot stand without the lower, like but underneath a beautiful tree or rose bush, there's like um, dirty roots into the ground,
Hmm.
um, and maybe that's what I think about uh, uh, altruism or doing good. Like um, at a evolutionary time scale, all of that's evolved through all sorts of nasty and brutish evolutionary competition. Um, and perhaps there's some bright lights of group selection, or maybe it's all about just kin selection. I don't know. But then from that, sometimes we're able to arrange our society and our relationships in such a way where we can get win-wins, where I can do something good and there's some like psychological benefit to that for me, but it creates some good in the world for someone else.
Hmm. That's a very beautiful take. So it's like, even if people are behaving altruistically because they're fundamentally selfish and maybe they're getting something out of it, it still doesn't negate the good that altruism does.
Right. And maybe that's more plausible if you don't get too
Hmm.
hung up on trying to judge who is a good person or not.
Right. This seems to loop back with the uh, temporal discounting or non-discounting thing, because when people talk about selfish, it it usually seems more like you're being narrowly selfish and you screw other people over, But if you screw other people over in the long run, you're screwing yourself over too, because
Mm-hmm.
we're forced to live as a social species. So it
Game
seems
theory. I
like
love
what
game
is,
theory. Yeah.
yeah. So it's like what's maximally selfish if operating over a long enough time span is going to be
Uh-huh.
quite selfless, because even your worst enemy, if you were living your best life, they wouldn't be your enemy, they would be your friend.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, we I I kind of think about like um life as a set of uh, games that you can choose to play, and
Mhm.
set up challenges for yourself, and like trying to make the world a better place seems like a particularly hard challenge. Like it's real easy to
Mhm.
tear down, um, but it's pretty hard to build, and to me that makes it like more worthwhile.
Mhm. Now, you hinted at earlier morality being pretty subjective, as in like, well, whatever our morality is evolved for a specific environmental context, and we're trying to maximize some sort of uh, evolutionary outcome. So like, I guess your chances of survival and reproduction, that can be achieved in all sorts of ways. Like, so if you're behaving altruistically to gain a certain level of social status or acceptance in your community that increases your chances of survival and reproduction, then that could be like the evolutionary ultimate motive. So it's subjective in that sense. But then I'm wondering if there's something like a meta morality emerging in the game theory, almost like a natural law, like there's some sort of optimization function. So for
Hmm.
any given environmental context, there would be an objectively adaptive strategy. And then if something is adaptive enough over a large enough span of context, then it's, well, again, sort of akin to a natural law. Because like tit for tat is a good example of this, where you get emergent reciprocal altruism across a variety of games, and it can be completely self-learned by AI. And then we look at that and say, oh, the AI learned to be fair. But another way to look at that is something like the AI learned what is optimal, and our sense of what is fair evolved out of what is optimal.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I kind of hesitate because like I wonder like uh is there something more like real about the long term than the short term? That's kind of the mistake we talked about before, that sometimes you can actually um make a mistake by focusing on too much on the long term.
Mhm.
And so uh perhaps yeah, like if like in terms of like a game theory idea, like as you play like repeated games, then it
Mhm.
becomes more advantageous to cooperate rather than defect. Um, uh, I don't know. I suppose like there's some value in that perspective, because then we can ask like how do we design more repeated games, um, and make society that sort of place where like it's in your interest to cooperate, because you're gonna be playing this game again.
Mhm. Yeah, that overemphasis on the long term could be its own pathology of something like effective altruism, especially if you're talking about something like population control, where it's like,
Yeah.
and this would be an extreme dystopia where it's population control means people have to die in order, that kind of like Thanos in the Avengers, where he's like his ultimate goal is to wipe out half the universe's population so that the remaining half may thrive and not be resource scarce.
Oh, okay.
So then
Yeah.
that would be like so long term, where, and I mean, on the surface it's a noble goal, except he's discounting like the billions of lives that he'd be destroying in the short term to try and achieve that stable,
Yeah.
thriving universe.
Yeah. I think one of the challenges with like the effective altruism movement is like a particular um, philosophy associated with it, that got a lot of play 6 months ago, when Will McCaskill reached uh, published a new book about long termism. which is this idea that you ought to prioritize the very far future, or as a society, we ought to give at least some consideration to our long-term future, and how we can, as a species or as a planet, create a thriving long-term future, and that has consequences that we would, at some level, deprioritize things that are important in the short term in order to achieve those long-term goals. And yeah, there is definitely some debate over that. I think one of the and I think one of the challenges there is, how much do you really know about what will help the long-term future? And like people like effective altruists, the sort of people that like get their calculators out and try and like work out the expected value of a particular action, maybe that process can leverage some cognitive biases that lead people to be systematically overconfident in their estimation of the effects of their actions now on the long-term future. And that seems like something to be pretty wary of.
We've talked about pros and cons of each orientation. Like if you have an overly short-term bias, then you will take risks in the classic sense, and that wouldn't be good for your long term. And then we've talked about pathologies of an overly long-term view. So then you might look at all that and say, okay, then the middle ground is what's adaptive. And especially if you're thinking about this from an evolutionary perspective, you might think, and there's going to be maybe like a normal distribution of how impulsive people are, or what their sort of concrete to abstract strategy is on average. And then on average, the average one would be most adaptive. So is that to say, sit back and think, on average, we're doing what's optimal? Or do you think that there's something to move towards, like an ideal to progress towards, of whatever the optimal decision-making strategy is? We're not currently there, but it's something humanity as a whole could move towards.
I'm afraid I might not be fully following, but I find myself sort of resisting the idea that, like, again, that there's going to be an objective truth here, and like maybe
I'll give
it's
you
just
one
like,
more either or to maybe make it clearer. So one view, I've heard a lot about this in the context of it's the theory that the evolutionary mismatch hypothesis. So the basic idea is that in our evolutionary past, it made sense to have more of a short-term orientation, especially people talk about this with regards to diet. So the idea is, in our evolutionary past, foods that were high fat, high sugar were pretty rare. So we developed a taste for them, but now they're abundant and we have such a taste for them that it's maladaptive, and it makes you make poor dietary choices. So the idea there is something like, as a species, what was a short-term orientation that used to serve us is no longer serving us, and we need something more like a long-term orientation built into us. So that would be one approach, and that would say something like, there is an optimal decision-making strategy, and we're currently falling short of that, and we need to progress towards that. And then the other one would be something like, no, there's no such thing as optimal beyond in a specific context, and the only thing that's happened is our context has shifted, and we should remain as flexible as possible.
Yeah. I don't know. This just still sounds like a tension that there's going to be a danger in going too much in one of those two directions. It's like Nietzsche's idea, like, do we want to be like Apollonian rationalists who like calculate the best thing to do and then go and do that, or do we want to like I forget the opponent of that, like completely follow our passions and go get the ice cream because like that feels good. I don't care if I know that I was evolutionarily optimized to do that and it's unhealthy for me. Christopher Hitchens was a controversial public intellectual who died about 10 years ago, and he died at the age of about 65, and he was a heavy drinker and a heavy smoker, and you would see him on the Tonight Show or whatever he was on, like with his glass of whiskey in hand. And he died of cancer as a direct result of his vices. And he kind of said, "Yeah, but I had a really good run. Like, I enjoyed this. I wouldn't do it different." And so, to some degree, it's like kind of down to what you value. And I don't have a good answer of like how individuals should decide what to value. Maybe that's a dodge, because like I'm here kind of as someone who's indicated, like I probably think that we should be considering the long-term future more, and so I ought to be able to justify that, right?
Right. It sounds like the field of decision neuroscience as a whole is moving more towards the importance of environmental context in decision-making strategies, as opposed to something like treating that strategy as a trait that you just carry with you.
Right. I mean, I don't have a handle on the field clearly enough to affirmatively,
Well, I have even less
like
of one, so
assert,
that was
right,
definitely
that that's
an
a
extrapolated.
direction that things are going. But I would hope so, because like I guess like to the extent that the marshmallow research has been criticized, and that felt like more of a replicability crisis pushback at the time. But perhaps it's a part of like us thinking like a little bit more contextually about our understanding of the human mind as we get the tools to study things in greater contextual detail.
This has been a wide-ranging and hopefully effective, hopefully towards some altruistic goal conversation. Thank you very much for your time, Ben.
Thank you very much, Adam. It's been great to talk with you.